Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today on the EBA Guidelines on Outsourcing. I'm Mike King, Head of Procurement and Third-Party Management at TORI Global, a consultancy specialising in financial services. By way of brief introduction, my background has always been in procurement and third-party management across a number of major FS institutions and predominantly leading large-scale IT outsourcing programs, as well as managing the complex supply chains that result from such outsourcing and other major events such as M&A activity. Having had to apply and manage the outputs of the processes involved in regulations such as this, it's been with great interest to see the development of these guidelines, how they will be applied in practice, and see the evolution of good practice in the industry.
And hi, my name is Martin Cotterill. I'm a partner in Taylor Wessing in the commercial technology and data team, where I lead the outsourcing practice, and I have a particular focus on financial services. And over the last 19 years, I've been involved with the majority of the world's largest financial institutions on some of their most strategic outsourcing deals. Now, one of the main reasons why Mike and I came together on this project was, whilst we might work in different lanes within the same pool, working together we found we had a commonality of approach, one that perhaps can be summarised as never take anything at face value. And it's that approach that informs this webinar, because whilst the EBA guidelines can be viewed as a set of regulations that requires a compliance targeting approach at one level, through the process of development of some of the toolkits that we decided to develop together, we broke apart these guidelines to an almost forensic level and reassembled the constituent threads. And it was through this process that we were drawn towards a rather overwhelming conclusion that we'll speak of today, that this set of guidelines is far from merely being a set of compliance exercises. It is, in fact, a starting point from which we can launch into a much more robust set of requirements and arrangements that will govern outsourcing deals going forward. Actually, in the same way, I approached CISC-8 back when that was the overriding regulation. I was often asked questions of whether CISC-8 would apply in certain circumstances, and I always considered that question somewhat reductive, because the essence of what CISC-8 has always been a base set of requirements that should be baked into pretty much every single outsourcing deal. So today, whilst we'll not be dwelling on the minutiae of what the guidelines actually say, you can read most of that for yourselves well enough. They're remarkably clear. We will delve into certain areas for sure, but rather we're going to take a look at what's changed, so we can gain a sense of that shift in perspective that has occurred, as well as looking at how this will impact both those who are regulated by it, the institutions, and the community of those who service the institutions, supply organisations and Fintechs, who are already being impacted, but who can do a great deal to make this burden on them work for them, or in the very least, take steps to lighten this burden substantially. Now, of course, no talk of European-born legislation would be complete without answering the obvious question on Brexit, not on Brexit, but how that applies to this set of legislation, to which there's a very easy answer. And then we're going to take a deeper dive at how these guidelines can be viewed as a starting point that points certain directions and will need to be evolved to really convert them into operational realities and bring value to your organisation, and how we've made steps to approaching this. Questions will be flying up on our screen, and if we catch them in time through the webinar, we will try and answer them. However, we'll certainly make time for them at the end, so fear not, we'll try and get through as many of them as we possibly can, time allowing. So let's start at the beginning and take a short spell to look at what these guidelines cover, and I'll hand over to Mike.
Great, thanks Martin. Okay, so let's take a look at exactly what are the EBA guidelines. The guidelines have been designed to reflect a harmonised framework for the management of outsourcing arrangements across the EU, moving away from the individual arrangements that were in place within each member state. The guidelines focus on the concept of an empty shell, in that the in-scope institutions must evidence sufficient control and maintain the capability and capacity to effectively oversee the outsourced function. In summary, the guidelines cover internal governance, outsourcing policy and processes, minimum contractual standards, effective oversight, and exit management. The genesis of the guidelines can be traced back to recent financial services legislation, many of which apply to specific sectors of the industry. For example, the Capital Requirements Directive and the PRA Rulebook for dual registered firms, MiFID II, including the FCA Handbook, Senior Management Arrangements, or SISC as Martin mentioned just now, and the Payment Services Regulations for payment service providers. The guidelines apply to all institutions under the EBA's remit, specifically banks, building societies, investment firms, and payment and electronic money providers. Whilst they do not extend to the insurance industry, it is interesting to note the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, EIOPA, has recently concluded its consultations on outsourcing to the cloud, mirroring the approach the EBA took in reaching their outsourcing to the cloud guidelines before progressing to the wider outsourcing guidelines we are discussing today. For those who are interested, EIOPA's cloud guidelines come into force on the 1st of July 2020, and insurance clients may well then be interested in this summary to see where regulation in their space may be heading. For the EBA guidelines, the implementation date was the 30th of September 2019 for any new arrangements or any arrangements under review, with all existing arrangements needing to be reviewed and remediated by the 31st of December 2021. As Martin and I have dissected and broken down the guidelines and built up our responses to it, it became clear there's really four key thematics that run throughout. The foundation is a sound, solid internal governance framework, and this is then enhanced through the application of a second theme, the third-party risk management framework, which is aligned to the organisation's wider risk practices. Upon this then are built the core outsourcing management capabilities, including the outsourcing policy, managing conflicts of interest, the business continuity planning process, roles and responsibilities of internal audit, and the outsourcing register. Finally, we look at the outsourcing processes, both pre and post supplier selection, which includes all of your due diligence, risk management, supervisory conditions, and conflicts of interest, and for contracting, minimum contracting standards, management of sub-outsourcing, data security, access and audit rights, and termination. So, having understood a bit of background as to what the guidelines are, let's now focus on how they've evolved from pre-30th of September. To give a scale of the new guidelines, we've reviewed some of the salient points and analysed how they've developed into where they are today. As we go through these slides, it should be noted that we're focusing on the differences between the FCA's handbook, in particular SISGate, and these new guidelines. As I've already said, you can trace the genesis of these guidelines back to multiple pieces of legislation. However, for many, like me in the procurement and supply management space, SISGate's been a baseline in outsourcing management for many years. Okay, so let's take a look at a few areas. Firstly, the outsourcing policy. The requirement for organisations to have an outsourcing policy was not explicit under SISGate or indeed the EBA's cloud outsourcing guidelines, although of course it could be implied. You can, however, trace the requirement back to other sources of legislation, for example, the EBA's guidelines on internal governance, which came into effect themselves on the 30th of June 2018. What the EBA guidelines does change, in a common theme across the guidelines, is a level of specificity around each requirement, and we'll go into more detail around these shortly. Second, let's look at conflicts of interest, and it's a similar theme to the outsourcing policy. The topic is not covered under SISGate, but it can be traced again to the internal governance guidelines I've just mentioned, and it also includes elements such as the arm's length agreements for internal service providers mentioned in the Bank of England's Operational Continuity in Resolution, OCIR, requirements. Regardless, the new guidelines provide a clear requirement to demonstrate objective decision-making in selecting service providers and ensuring conflicts of interest are effectively identified, analysed and managed, including those within the organisation's group structure. Perhaps of any element within these guidelines, third-party risk management has seen one of the most considerable evolutions since the SysGate requirements. Previously under SysGate, the obligation was to only identify, manage, monitor and report risks and internal control mechanisms, as well as adequately managing the risks associated with outsourcing. The EBA Outsourcing Guidelines now requires detailed, scenario-based risk assessments with a specific focus on material risk areas, including step-in, subcontractor, and data and system security risk.
The other main feature, and one which is rather an important element to all of this, it's where a lot of the information sources will need to be contained, is the requirement for an outsourcing register. Now, a requirement for an outsourcing register or a comprehensive register is not new. It's certainly new from SysGate, but it was always a feature of the cloud outsourcing guidelines. But this is a requirement that now extends to all critical and important outsourcing, which, if you break down what a critical and important outsourcing is, means pretty much everything except the glaringly obvious exceptions. There are the two key changes from what happened before the 30th of September, and one being the level of information that will need to be recorded, which we'll go through in a little bit more detail just now. But perhaps more importantly is the requirement this cannot be a static list. It's got to be a living, breathing information source that must be reviewed, updated and reassessed over time. And probably the most important element of this is where changes are identified, acted upon. Now, the elements of the guidelines are the contract requirements. Now, the guidelines contain predictably a much more detailed set of requirements that must be a feature of outsourcing contracts, far more than SysGate once imposed, albeit in similar topic areas. But perhaps the most notable feature to extract from this comparative analysis is to recognise these requirements fall broadly into two distinct buckets. The requirements that are, the first sort of set of buckets are the requirements that are mandatory and specific. And what I mean by that is those that are expressed as requirements that allow very little room to manoeuvre. These are imposed on you. There are restrictions on controls on subcontracting. There are certain termination rights that you just have to have. There are access and audit requirements, and these just to name a few. There is very little room for negotiation, manoeuvring, or creativity in how these are expressed. But the second bucket is what we will class as outcome-based requirements. These express themselves as provisions that must achieve a certain outcome, or are designed to achieve that outcome, such as performance management, i.e. the way that your outsourcing is monitored, measured, and its performance is dealt with. The governance requirements on what oversees and how the management of outsourcing is impacted, and access to information, and perhaps more importantly, exit planning and business resilience, all of which will allow freedom for some degree of creativity in how they operate in any particular contract. And it's these in particular that will need to be calibrated through your risk management lens, and certainly a feature of your outsourcing policy. So let's explain and look at, in a much more detailed way, how this falls into your overriding policies that must determine the future direction of outsourcing in your organisation. Mike.
Thanks, Martin. So let's take a detailed look at some of these concepts, and as Martin said, let's take a more detailed look at the outsourcing policy. Building an effective outsourcing policy in line with the guidelines, we think, can be summed up into 5 key areas. The first relates to defining roles and responsibilities, including specifically identifying a senior manager or a specific function with outsourcing responsibility, and this has parallels to the SMCR regime. The second focuses on ensuring effective processes are in place to identify some of the core concepts and key elements that are discussed throughout the guidelines. This includes where functions are defined as critical or important, which was the old materiality test, where regulators are required to be notified, and identifying instances of intergroup outsourcing. The third element covers effective planning and processes for outsourcing implementation, and that can include processes such as effectively defining the organisation's requirements and ensuring that it processes through an approval process. The fourth area covers risk management, and we will talk about risk management more in a few minutes. And finally, the fifth looks at effective management, including performance management of the service provider and ensuring independent oversight and audit of the outsourcing arrangements. Now, the representation here of these elements built in the circle are shown here as no mistake. What's critical here is that each element is a key part of a wider process, each feeding and reacting to the other. To simply have each element in place on its own is not sufficient, but rather organisations should build an incremental framework and bring it to life through a clear and carefully managed implementation, so all and each end users understand how best to manage any given scenario and not to react simply through binary choices.
Now, the guidelines also talk quite extensively about managing conflicts of interest and to proactively manage those conflicts of interest. What we mean by conflict of interest? Well, it's a situation which the outcome or aims of two different parties are incompatible. A broad definition, but one which requires a framework in place to actually identify them and then deal with them if they arise. Now, one of the most important nuggets to extract from this particular topic on the guidelines is to realise that the guidelines themselves do not prohibit the existence of a conflict of interest. Quite the opposite. Rather, the most important focus and the emphasis of the guidelines is you have to have measures in place that demonstrate you can identify them and when you do, manage them actively. Mike has had this very conversation with representatives of one of the two main UK regulators who've confirmed this thinking and even made the point that it could be perfectly possible for a well-managed and balanced arrangement where a potential conflict existed to be a positive thing, but only where the measures in place made this the case, i.e. where the positives outweighed the potential downsides and where the downsides had plans put around them to make sure they didn't come to fruition. So, for example, if you have concentrations of decision-making and recommending powers in the hands of too few people, then you open the possibilities of a conflict arising. Without measures in place to rebalance that potential conflict, you're creating a potential issue and a potential compliance problem. But conflicts of interest that are patently well managed with robust measures in place are okay. But if you cannot demonstrate this or just paying lip service to the requirements, you are definitely going to be heading into trouble. And all of these elements need to work into your approach to managing risk.
So let's take a more detailed look at risk management under the guidelines. Building a view as to the risks of the outsourcing and informing the decision-making, planning and resulting execution, the guidelines frame a number of steps which should be followed. The first is the classification of the function. This supports building the relevant risk lenses through which to assess the relative risks of the proposed outsource. With that important context, a scenario-based risk assessment should then be undertaken, focusing on high-severity operational risks, which include the impact of failed or continually inadequate services. The guidelines are clear. The approach should be tailored to the level of specific risks of the outsource and be undertaken in line with the proportionality principle. So institutions should adjust the implementation of these assessments in a manner relative to its own size, scale and risk profile. The risk assessment should consider processes, systems, people and external factors, ultimately producing a balanced benefit versus risk analysis. It's really important to note that the guidelines' intent is not to kill the outsource with risk, but instead to highlight areas in need of its greatest focus and drive effective mitigation between both parties. Finally, all good risk management processes should ensure a process of continuous review, maintaining a current view of the arrangement in its current size, complexity and risk sensitivity. Throughout this process, the guidelines focus on a number of risk lenses which must be included. For example, concentration risk, geopolitical risk, and data security. We would strongly suggest embedding these risk elements into your operational risk framework and extend or expand upon these risk lenses to risks specific to your organisation and the function in scope to be outsourced. This might, for example, include a focus on physical security in cases of asset protection.
Now, as we mentioned, one of the key bits of artifacts, if you like, which is going to be quite central to how you manage this, is going to be your outsourcing register, which I'm sure everyone has in place and is starting to build and manage and actively progress. But the outsourcing register has taken a rather step change in its detail. Whilst there are some salient points that apply to any outsourcing that still being maintained, and if you look on the slides, there's the usual gamut of things which one could categorise as sort of pedestrian sort of requirements that you capture. If you take a look at what is required for critical and important outsourcing, you'll see a vast number of things, all of which have a certain element to them, a certain aspect to them, which is ongoing and productive active management of them. They all are not to be frozen in time. So apart from recording things like what, if any, is it a part of any IPS scheme? What is the governing law of the agreement? What the annual budget is? There's a lot of these elements here which are specifically designed to be ongoing measurements and monitoring, such as the date of the most recent risk assessment, who or what is making the decision for approving and monitoring the outsourcing, when is the next scheduled audit, how has it occurred, who are the subcontractors, what is the status of reintegration into the business, i.e. your exit planning strategies, are there alternative providers, has that changed, what is the time criticality within these outsourcings? None of these things can ever be frozen in time. So this is going to become a very important tool to keep alive and react to change as things move. The other important tool in here, and one which feeds into all of this, is the contracting standards. It'll be almost the output of your risk management framework. It'll be those things which all these assessments and reviews should ultimately feed into. And as I mentioned, the requirements in place that now have broadly split themselves into two buckets, these mandatory requirements and these outcome-based requirements. But perhaps the two that are most talked about, or at least two that seem to elicit the most questions and responses, are the areas of access and audit and subcontracting, with the reactions ranging from incredulity to, oh, this will be impossible to achieve, neither of which are really accommodated. It's just a fact of life now in this industry, so best we find solutions, and solutions there are. Let's take audits, the audit requirements. There have already been good and bad examples in these industry from suppliers who are starting to show signs of either industrializing the problem and preparing really robust solutions that allow them to control these processes. Cloud providers, for example, have pre-prepared processes, formats, abilities for you to walk into their front door in something which was never possible before, or never thought to be possible before. But those reactions have also been very poorly, with half volleys being thrown into the industry, such as reports of suppliers throwing SOC 2 reports with a dismissive, there you go, job done sort of shrug. So these requirements are there, and we see in this area in particular there should be a rise in industrialised solutions. We can see trusted third-party services developing, similar to some of the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements that were dealt with. If you stretch your imagination far enough, it's not entirely without merit that there could ultimately end up being a sort of kite mark that are applied to service provision. This service is EBA compliant. Subcontracting also is an area which is focused on by a lot of people because it controls on how it can occur, what needs to flow down on the requirements of those sub-outsources, and if those flow downs are to existing arrangements which are already in place, that can create difficulties and inevitably be tricky. But it remains a fact that if a proposed solution exists that denies your ability to effectively pull back or terminate subcontracted services without undue impact on the resilience of your business, then it's not a solution, certainly not one which fits within the framework of the EBA guidelines. Some might say it never should have been. So there are inevitable complexities for established deals as well. These things are going to have to be remediated over the next 2 years, as Mike mentioned. And for many, this is going to be rather a tight deadline. because of these complexities, especially in established services. It's worthy of mention that whilst the focus of the requirements is on critical or important outsourcing, the guidelines also express requirements, albeit a lesser number, that apply whether or not anything is classified as critical or important. But I think, as we've been emphasising, we think all of these things create opportunities that can be gained that will significantly improve your arrangement. Let's have a look at a few of those opportunities. Mike.
Thanks, Martin. And just before we move on, actually, we've had a question coming in, so we might be good to cover that just before we move on to the next section. So the question is, can you give a couple of examples of types of conflict of interest that might occur and who they are between? So I think I have a couple of good examples of that. One is one of the service owner who was involved in an RFP, who had a good, strong history and relationship with a particular service provider and wanted to recommend them in to a new organisation that he was working in. Again, that's fine as long as there's any conflict of interest is declared and it's clear who the decision-making bodies are, or decision-making people are, and it's all managed, in an open and transparent manner. The other perhaps really interesting one is a discussion around the potential conflict of interest in intergroup outsourcing. It's something that's come up on a couple of occasions, and ensuring you've got what's termed as an arm's length agreement in place between the group service provider and the branch service recipient. And that it's important that that's produced on commercial arm's length terms to enable the branch to be able to effectively manage its service provision and risk management.
Yeah, and there's another potential one, especially in the fintech market, where a lot of institutions are progressing their investment into fintechs. And you can see a situation, one of which I've already experienced, is where an institution invested into a fintech is also buying services. Actually, it's going to become a major purchase of services from that fintech. There, in and of itself, that creates a conflict of interest, but one which can exist but needs to be managed.
Absolutely. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so over the first couple of sections of this presentation, we focused on the requirements of the guidelines, and we've discussed their detailed and prescriptive nature. For many, this could be considered to be quite a significant overhead. However, Martin and I really believe there is an alternative view. These guidelines offer a consolidated view of good industry practice across the supply management and outsourcing space. So leveraging this could turn overhead into a considerable opportunity. We argue that implementing the guidelines is the first step in the process and not the last. Building a proportionate, flexible, intuitive framework and process should allow organisations to leverage market-leading supply capabilities. It should help reduce the speed to market and drive cost optimisation. Organisations can do that if supplier risk is better identified, analysed and mitigated. This opportunity will not come to realisation, however, where rigid risk processes are in place or too great a burden is pushed to the first-line risk owners without sufficient support. I have personally seen many instances where sizable risk management frameworks are sent out within the organisation and it's left to procurement, supplier management or service managers to implement the frameworks and processes, often with little support or unintuitive tooling. This may well result in either an overly cautious approach or a lost opportunity, or indeed ineffective risk mitigations, missing the point of the guidelines entirely. In addition, real innovation and business advantage could be lost through a failure to partner effectively with service providers and agree on solutions which can meet the spirit of the regulations. This could include a more balanced approach to exit management or to reduce overly burdensome audit requirements through appropriate use of grouped audit rights and independent third-party reviews. It's important to stress as well, I'm not saying that service providers should not be held to the common standards established in the guidelines and driven to ensure their services are delivered in a manner consistent with the requirements. Organisations should communicate these regulatory requirements early and require service providers and partners to review how they can ensure compliance. In this space, the most proactive service providers will seize on a significant opportunity.
And that's important to recognise. If you provide services to an EBA institution, the requirements that will already be impacting your community can be turned into a market differentiator. So how do we do this? Why is our thinking led down this way? Well, service providers who recognise the needs of the market and get on the front foot have always, traditionally and through any RFP process, been the leaders in that RFP process. Here is a set of guidelines, a set of open source requirements that financial institutions know they have to comply with, know they have to ask of you, know that have to be a feature of your tenders that you're going to respond to. So respond to them. It doesn't get simpler than that. So consider the fact that these guidelines give you this detailed roadmap and start to work out how you're going to respond to. We gave an example of a supplier throwing across a set of SOC 2 reports going, there you go. Wasn't dealt with very well and wasn't particularly received very well. So if you can develop solutions to these mandatory requirements, particularly around those really tricky areas like audit processes, you know you're going to have this upon you if you work in this industry. How do you deal with the potential burden of multiple clients asking to audit you throughout the year? How do you smooth that process out? Then your lives will get easier. Consider also the fintech community. Now, one of the features of that is clearly that they're starting up at various phases in their growth of their company. A lot of nervousness, especially if you're buying quite important features that are going to be integrated into your institution from these companies. A lot of focus is on that risk of those smaller companies failing. All these things, the confidence you can gain, you can impart upon the clients that you work for, can be enhanced significantly if you can prove that you have got and considered all the requirements and come up with a set of very robust solutions for them. So we can imagine a situation where those who actually take the effort to put these in place and roll them out will start to see a real benefit when they do business with financial institutions.
Okay, so having looked at some of the key elements of the guidelines as well as some of our perspectives on their implementation, we'll now address a couple of common questions that we get from our clients. The first one, as it often is the impact of Brexit. And unfortunately, the answer here is fairly straightforward. The guidelines will apply post-Brexit, regardless of the outcome, that I know we're all very keen to hear. This is seen in the FCA statement that's included here on the slide. It clearly states persons requiring authorisation or recognition to continue to provide services in the UK post-exit date will become subject to these expectations. And this is true even in the event of a no-deal Brexit, with an MOU already in place between the EBA and UK regulators to satisfy the cooperation agreement requirement for continued application. So, in summary, firms should plan on the guidelines applying in full, as we've discussed throughout this presentation. So the second question that we get asked regularly is, so what do we do now? As we have been saying consistently throughout the session, we strongly believe the guidelines are a starting point, which should be seen as minimum requirements. The guidelines are seeking to drive out right behaviours, not focus on checklists, and drive out unintended consequences, not simply a process of allocating risk. Over the next few slides, we'll take a look at where organisations can move from good to best practice in applying these guidelines. So, when reviewing your governance model, organisations should clarify your governance models carefully across the organisation and clearly assign roles and responsibilities. Implement an integrated and holistic third-party management process. Align it to your operational risk approach and look how the process can dynamically respond to risk in order to unlock and preserve value. Effectively communicate and embed the process in your organisation and make sure it's easy to understand and to operate. Actively discourage simple box ticking. Finally, incorporate existing processes that address key risk areas of the guidelines, such as data protection and business continuity. When looking at your policies and processes, you should look at your risk planning processes and ensure they provide actionable, tailored outputs for each outsourcing, and these can then be factored into joint planning and joint mitigation activities. Run effective scenario planning and drive out real and specific issues, and in response define robust measures to manage the risk, not just police it. Build sufficient time in your processes to proactively assess options for compliance. It's true that one size doesn't fit all. Each case should be taken on its own merits and solutions designed appropriately. Leverage existing capabilities and tooling that you already have within your organisation to gather the information that you need. Identify weaknesses in those processes and build in plans to address. And finally, design business continuity and exit management plans that are real and that cater to each specific arrangement. Again, one size doesn't fit all, and templates alone shouldn't drive the content.
So in looking at your existing outsourcing arrangements and in creating new ones and contracting for them here with the minimum contracting requirements and overlaid with the risk management framework, the requirements of the ongoing management and monitoring of your outsourcing register, how do we move that? Well, to take things into best practice, the focus is all around proactive and management through a lifetime. So that requires a certain linkage between all these things, linking your risk framework to your contract framework. And if your risk framework is properly defined and run, it will give you a set of priorities for each engagement. It'll give you a set of priorities for your remediation of those contracts that you need to do over the next 2 years. And all of this which should translate into contractual priorities and what you need to focus on, and perhaps more importantly, what you don't need to focus on. What just needs to be there to some degree, covered off, but not a major feature with all the bells and whistles attached to it. And hey presto, you've just given yourself a very effective negotiation plan, which is a very powerful tool, not only in negotiating new contracts, but also how you approach remediation of your existing ones. A sort of scattergun approach of going out there to all your existing service providers and giving them a standard form, here's what you need to sign up to, whilst commendable, is probably not going to be the most optimal approach, and probably not one that's going to get done in the 2-year timescale, considering some organisations' sheer number of service providers that have to be covered by this. I think also one of the most important things when you're looking at this is to identify both in new contracts and existing ones what I'll classify as risk shift and risk share provisions. Are those provisions which throw risk across to the supplier or create some situation where the risk of something is shared between it in some contractual framework? And I think you should be suspicious of them. And what I mean by that is you need to keep a real beady eye on them. Because shifting risk and thinking that it's closed using project management parlance is not good enough. They will not meet the requirements of the guidelines. What you need to then do is work out, either through the contracting process or through your risk management framework, and certainly through the feedback into your outsourcing register, how these things are being dealt with, how they're being followed up, and more importantly, how they might change. This should also lead you to build a roadmap for your review and assessment of these deals. What might have changed? Are there any circumstances that are different? Have any conflicts of interest that have arisen which weren't previously there? All of these things need to build in to these processes, and more importantly, need to be followed up on. So what you start to build is like a contract calendar, and ideally a shared one. There's all these considerations that informed our thinking when Mike and I started to look on how we might develop sets of tools that respond to this. Certainly, being in the service provider market ourselves, how do we respond to this? How can we help our clients move through these things? And we saw this opportunity to develop and evolve tools that will allow this sort of dynamic flexibility in there. A snapshot we've just thrown up on the screen now. A suite of dynamic templates and policies that help identify the right focus rather than just assume one. One of the things Mike and I talk about is template bias. That thing of throwing across here's one we did earlier, the sort of Blue Peter approach to things. And everyone just blindly follows that as the answer. So how can we make that something which is more dynamic and allows specificity to the particular arrangements it's attacking? Looking at internal governance and third-party risk tools that are adjustable and proportionate in the way it approaches risk management. And certainly we've got some thoughts and tools around how you might design a pragmatic and measured approach to remediation of existing arrangements. And all that feeds into a flexible contracting standard template that links your risk tools to your contracting responses. So the output of your risk management analysis will give you the roadmap to what are important things to focus on in your contract. And perhaps the area that needs, I think, industry-wide most help is methodologies to help develop exit management plans that don't just get tempered by template bias. These have to be looked at almost now as business continuity plans, business resilience plans. They fall into the same category. They have to be built to address a particular situation, but they have to be tested. I don't mean scenario tested, but in some way they have to be made sure that those things can actually be executed, and more importantly, you might have to demonstrate to your regulator that you've gone through this thinking. So in this way, we're really quite certain these guidelines can be a force for good across the industry and significantly enhance how we operate. Certainly iron out the case studies of disaster stories, which become ubiquitous in webinars like these. So I think we've come to the end of our our run-through piece, but there have been questions coming in.
Quite a few questions, yeah, that's good to answer. So let's run through a few of those then. So firstly, Martin, perhaps you can help with this one. How rigid are the audit requirements that are included in the contract? They're often very onerous, and suppliers are reacting simply no.
No. Yes, and you just echoed the reason why we picked one of those that as an example, and that is almost universally the knee-jerk reaction to this. The answer, I mean, the simple answer is, I think on face value they appear onerous. Certainly when you've got to throw the doors open to the regulator, they have to have almost unfettered access, and you as a regulated institution have to have certain access, not unfettered. Actually, neither are unfettered in reality. There are requirements and standards that you have to apply to. But the real answer here is get over it, supply organisations. It's not something they can deny. If they're smart, you can work with them to actually build something that might help that situation. We talked of trusted third-party services, and the guidelines talk about this themselves, that there may be situations, depending on the type of outsourcing, where audits, you don't have to walk in the front door. There are certain things you have to preserve that to be the case, like regulatory audit, for example. But where you don't have to be disruptive about it, where you can have a trusted third party to gain that access and do that audit on almost the suppliers and your behalf, and perhaps for a cluster of suppliers, if it's a shared service, you could see that sort of thing occurring, and then that audit report coming out to that shared environment. Those sorts of things will ease the passage, I think.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing, I think, is the requirement is holistic and complete. You can't say, oh, actually, it's not unfettered access. It's only once a year, and it's only on a regulated amount. That you can't get away from that. But perhaps what you can do is find ways to reduce the overall burden of the audit. For example, using third parties in certain circumstances.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think it's a really sort of neat follow-on question then that's come up, which is, what do you do if an essential supplier who's providing a critical and important service simply won't entertain revising their T's and C's in line with the guidelines? So I think it's that point, but wider, right? And I think the summary is they will be non-compliant come, or certainly the end of 2021.
Yeah.
If you're reviewing or renewing now, clearly non-compliant earlier.
Yep.
But it will be a non-compliant arrangement,
yep.
And you will be in breach of regulation. Yep. And we've seen, albeit with previous regulation, the regulators will act on that, and they will react to poorly managed outsourcing or non-compliant outsourcing.
Yep.
So and Martin, you can echo this, I think, but ultimately that arrangement will need to be remediated, either through effective exit management and moving to a supplier who will cooperate, or driving the supplier to put in place what it needs to.
Yeah.
Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. And maybe it's just ignorance on their part.
May well be.
If it's also a question of leverage. If you're the only financial services client they've got, perhaps this is new to them. But if they're operating in this industry, all of them are going to be asking the same question.
Yeah.
And there's only so much, if they can want to continue in business, that they can resist this. And as you say, if they become non-compliant, I mean, it does put you in a difficult position if you're locked into a deal for longer than this 2-year remediation period, and it's got limited opportunity to get out. It puts you in a very tricky situation, and you've got to start thinking about how you deal with that, which might mean some sort of termination event, and certainly might mean going to talk to your regulator.
Great, thank you. And then we've got another question. So do you have examples of critical and important monitoring that can help us to calibrate what the level and expectation practically looks like? So that's an interesting one, and I think this comes back to looking at a tailorable risk management process, right? So, and in fact, it's one of the tools that we've been helping to develop, which is assess each of the key risk areas that are relevant to your organisation or to your suppliers. And from that, it's something I call a tailored governance plan, but build a set of governance activities that happen on the back of that, which can help initial due diligence on ongoing effective monitoring. So, a really good example would be if this is a really business critical service with significant business continuity issues in place, are you effectively reviewing your business continuity plan? Are you expecting the supplier to undertake business continuity tests and indeed sharing the output of those tests and the mitigations, and even ensuring that they are in place? Is this supplier going to be managing sensitive and personal data? In which case, have you done an effective IT audit? Are the right IT security standards in place? And how are you effectively supervising those from day to day? And actually, you'll have some suppliers at one end of the spectrum where your governance plans will be fairly small and concise, where they are, not quite the florists and the stationaries that we sometimes talk about, but some of the smaller providers may have only a few ongoing monitoring tasks or initial due diligence tasks. But if you're doing a global data center outsource, I would expect those governance plans to be fairly significant in size and cover all of the elements of the risk lenses. So hopefully that helps a bit with an answer to that question.
There's a question here. When we talk audit rights, are we referring to full end-to-end drains-up approach or targeted testing of particular controls operated by the supplier? I guess one element, it is more targeted in that sense rather than by end-to-end drains up. I guess that on one level, that sort of statutory audit level sort of thing. It's focused. I mean, the audit requirements are against the requirements of the guidelines. So it's against the risk management. Are you managing these risks? Are there imperfections in that in the way that they deliver services which create a problem? Is data handled in a way which you weren't aware of originally? Have things changed? So it's all framed against the guidelines. So I guess in that respect, it is a targeted testing, and you can build an audit framework against these requirements. But because these requirements are necessarily broad in some areas, that does lead you down some quite wide areas, particularly around, when you think about governance and service provision, the breadth of that, if you think about the context of services in a shared services environment, that would open up that audit into quite a wide remit. But in that sense, it's targeted against the guidelines, but could have quite a large effect on what you need to look at within the supplier organisation.
Yeah, and if you look at the language that's used within the regulations, and it says, and I quote, so full access to all relevant business premises, head office, operation centres, include the full range of relevant devices, systems, networks, information and data used for providing the outsourced function. I think, Martin, that was your point. It's what is relevant to the outsourcing function and what is relevant in the service provision. But the actual access and the audit rights are extensive, and for many organisations and for many suppliers, it's much more than they've been used to providing to their client base.
Absolutely. It's also why when we said, as an example, throwing a SOC 2 report back as a response is utterly out. It doesn't even begin to answer the question, because those sorts of things, apart from just being a very dismissive response, those sorts of things are very much generic internal control focused audits, have no focus on the actual outsourcing and scope of the outsourcing in question, and so would be an imperfect response to the requirements of the guidelines. One of the questions that has come up, if I look, is around our America. You can tell perhaps the jurisdiction where this might be coming from. If you've got a US supplier supplying to a UK regulated business, are they affected? And the answer, and unfortunately the short answer is yes. In the same way GDPR would affect you if you had data flowing across borders, or any personal data at all flowing. So yeah, the short answer is yes, and we've actually already seen that through some of our clients that are looking at remediating, going through the remediation process, and are having to deal with American suppliers who are sort of going, I'm sorry. So the reactions that are being identified in these questions are very much prevalent, and so there is. I mean, we're only on the start of this process. I know I say we've got 2 years to go, and at some point we're going to say we've only got a few months to go. But there is a bit of an education process occurring, in the same way there was one with the GDPR provisions, and the same way that actually in reverse happened to the UK when Sarbanes-Oxley came into effect. We're in that initial kind of what's this phase, and it will start to seep out there. We'll find it easier. I think suppliers that initially say hell no will start to turn around when they realise that this is not just a single client requesting it. It's not a whim. You can throw the regulations at them. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we've had throughout the webinar. I think we've caught everything. Obviously, if there are any other questions that anyone has around the call, please feel free to send them in. We'll be delighted to talk to you. And similarly, if there's anything that you've heard today, our details will be shared, and we'll follow up this webinar with all the slides and details for you.
There's one thing to also mention as well. Thank you for registering, but lucky winners of this registering competition, what we have is there's various artifacts that we will make available. Mike and I have written an article on this very subject, which kind of boils down in a way which isn't conditional upon our droning voices. The sort of themes on this, and goes into some areas a little bit more deeply. And our toolkits are as we're developing them and producing them, things are coming out of that, and we are going to make these available to this audience and our wider audience. So if you still want to, and you still register, you'll get emails with these sorts of things as follow-ups, and hopefully they'll be useful to you. But otherwise, thank you for your
sparing your lunch hour and listening through, and we hope to speak soon.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
All right.